everybody. Peter and I today are talking about the evolution and development of path-dependent, knowledge-intensive, resource-based growth in South Africa, and looking at how that evolved and some of the important legacies of it, as well as the connections between, I'm sure, most of these episodes in history that you all are probably at least partially familiar with. Going to begin by just giving a little bit of context in terms of how this relates to some mining and monetary history, then introduce this concept of resource-based development, and then we'll go into more details with our 3 case studies and talk about how they're interconnected. As everybody, or most everybody here I'm sure is reasonably familiar, the Witwatersrand gold deposits were a huge deal in terms of the world supply of gold. And I just pulled this together to give some context. Over here on the left-hand axis, South Africa's percentage of annual world gold production, and that's the orange line, and then the blue line is the metric tons of gold produced. Going from 1886 up to 2015, I don't have all the years shown on this axis, but they're represented in the line. The focus of what I'm going to talk about is how these deposits were developed and what sort of broke free in terms of the critical development of these deposits in South Africa at this period of time, originally in an independent Afrikaner state, but then later under the British Empire. And throughout, obviously, this gold has been important for the international gold standard. Looking up here, and I know there's some debate about these percentages. I use the Chamber of Mines, which is the South African Mining Bureau, for these numbers, but they claimed that it was upwards of 80% of the world gold output, particularly during the $35 an ounce fixed price, was coming from South Africa. As you all know, South Africa and the Soviet Union were primarily the only producers of gold at that time period. And we talk a little bit about how South Africa is in an unfortunate neighbor group with the Soviet Union because of its labor system. It wasn't much different than what was happening at some of the Russian mine or Soviet mines at that time period. Important legacies, obviously, in terms of the general context of bimetallism, the huge influx of Rand gold, particularly this early period where I'm talking about the development of this technology. Silver was again a real challenge in terms of continuing a bimetallic standard, but the outflows of gold from the Rand and the huge deposits which were unleashed, not only from the Rand, but from the technology that was industrialized on the Rand, helped really put an end to the argument for bimetallism. And also, in terms of underpinning the strength of the British Empire with its industrial expansion, its desire to be the lead currency, the Bank of England and the London gold market were all massively supported by this discovery here on the Rand, which we're contextualizing in our case study here. So what we contend in our paper is that it's a path-dependent phenomenon that explains how these resources were developed on the Rand, but they were preceded by an important legacy from Kimberley, and they had a huge subsequent path. And we look at one of the major sectors, which is the petrochemical sector, which was developed in South Africa from sort of this legacy that continued onward after the Rand. And these dynamic capabilities are interesting because oftentimes the sort of history of this concept of dynamic capabilities and path dependencies, dynamic capabilities are assumed to be within a firm, and it positions a firm to be more competitiveness. But what we are contending in this paper is that these dynamic capabilities were inter-organizational. They were a group system. It was a network of firms, and characterized somewhat distinctively from other instances of dynamic capabilities and other focuses. But there was a coherent and intercoherent legacy of these dynamic capabilities, which continues to this day as we look at challenges in some of the transformation of the platinum industry at the moment. You might have heard Americana. There was a big disruption up there. That continues to this day. And where this all started was at the diamond mines of Kimberley. What happened there was the discovery a little ways away from these diamond deposits in Kimberley. Along a river, alluvial deposits, they were finding diamonds on the shores of the river. And so, of course, this being the mid 1800s, a rush for prospectors descended, and they were all getting rich. They imposed their sort of, you get this little 10-foot section of the river, and this is what you can mine. And with that influx, the prospector community was there. They were developing things. But not so far away, they discovered some diamonds on the surface that weren't part of this alluvial deposit structure. And they noticed that if they sort of dug around a bit, they were finding more diamonds further down. And these were what are now known as kimberlite deposits, but they hadn't been known previously. They didn't know that there was a geologic formation from these volcanic pipes that you could find diamonds in. So when they first started tracing out these deposits, they said, okay, we have these alluvial restrictions. You get, I think it was a 10-foot by 10-foot, or maybe it was 15 by 15 allocation of property where you can get all your diamonds that you want. So they did that, and if you didn't mine your diamonds for 3 days on a trot, then your rights were revoked, and somebody else could take over those rights. So there was obviously incentive to dig fast and dig as much as you can. There's a complicated history in terms of how those property structures changed marginally over the time as the pits were being developed. But the punchline is there ended up being 3 pits like this one. This is the Kimberley pit itself. That were really large diamond deposits with these large kimberlite pipes. And what happened, because of this legacy of the alluvial deposits, people were digging these little square properties. You can maybe see a little piece there. But some were going faster than others. And as you dig down at different rates, you had collapses coming down. You had all sorts of issues in terms of what's going on with the mining and the externalities that are associated with it. You had some people breaking through underground water aquifers and flooding areas. And so all of a sudden, you had this really complex situation where there was this unprecedented scale of diamonds. Never before had there been this many diamonds available in the world market. So you had, the diamond cutters were trying to get their head around what they were supposed to do with all this. So the market structure was thrown into chaos. And you had, in terms of production, this chaos. What these lines are here are ropes coming up from the individual claims where they would haul their dirt up. And it's kind of a classic coordination problem. How do we fix this? and so there's a complicated history which we talk about in the paper, but it revolves around mining boards that were providing some of these collective resources in terms of securing some of the collapses, putting in walkways to access the claims, facilitating some of the lifting so not everybody had to have their own haulage system. and in general trying to work together, but also using them to consolidate power and ownership of the claims, and working to lobby for greater claim sizes so that you could own multiple claims. It was all played out here at Kimberley. And what it led to was this legacy of simultaneous coordination and competition, which led to a industry structure which was competing in terms of trying to get ownership of the diamonds and beat the other mining pit out. But at the same time, very similar to some of the things we see with collaborative innovation and open source innovation today, at the same time working together to be more competitive. And that's what was playing out here, where the technical challenges of accessing the diamonds, that knowledge was being shared. You had mining engineers that were going from one pit to the next saying, oh no, you're going to run into problems if you continue doing this here. You better look ahead and change this way. You better start looking at how are you going to go underground, and how are you going to get the ownership structure to go underground, because this isn't going to be sustainable for much longer. So that built this institution. At the same time as you were consolidating these claims with these incredible valuable diamonds, you had to get finance. And so it built this financial system as well, which was integrated and networked, and with linkages back to the diamond traders, but also other international financial connections. And that mattered a lot as we looked forward to Kimberley. And these are just a few of the important features that came out of this complex mixture of activities at Kimberley. This innovation system, this open innovation system, this infrastructure, which also was important in terms of developing the interior of Africa. Nothing had been brought out there before, and all of a sudden you had viable railroad lines going into the interior. You had transit systems that were being put in terms of transportation of goods to the interior. You had the first real urban settlement in the interior of Africa, and a launching point for other explorations throughout the interior. As I mentioned, this important globally connected financial system, and also, which we'll talk about in a little bit more detail with the Rand as well, the theft of diamonds created an opportunity to control the labor force and also disenfranchise part of the labor force. The black Africans were allowed to mine diamonds originally, but as this complex fight for control over the diamonds played out, interests were able to exclude them from ownership and able to take labor from other parts of the region, not the local black Africans, but from other parts of the region, and get them to actually agree to work in compounds because of, quote unquote, the security issue with the diamonds. That compound system would then be transferred over to the gold mining system, and it was a way to also sort of build up this institutionalized separation of labor power by color, and was important in terms of what became the broader system of apartheid in South Africa. And also with the growing consolidation of ownership, it became more capital intensive and more skill intensive. So you had these different classes of labor. So you had these foreign miners coming in that could work the machines. You had that were white. You had a domestic white population, the Afrikaners, that were traditionally sort of subsistence farmers almost, but they then began to get into some of these transport industries and also look for opportunities on the mines, but at a low skilled level, almost supervising the other workers, which would become much more entrenched with the gold mines. And importantly, not only at the ownership level in terms of the owners of the mines and with their linkages, but also at the production level in terms of these mining engineers and the people with the mining expertise. There was a huge system that was developed in terms of social capital and networks and internationally integrated, and a distinct political lobby, which was influenced by British imperial ambitions, but also domestic hope for development amongst the Afrikaners themselves. So all these institutions began to come to fruition at Kimberley. And just as the ownership was being consolidated, they began to trace out some of the deposits of the Witwatersrand. There had been gold deposits throughout Central Africa, Southern Africa, since the 1850s, alluvial deposits, which they had been following around. But as they followed what's now called the Witwatersrand Basin, they followed these surface deposits deeper underground, and they discovered that there was this massive, unprecedented deposit of gold, which continued further and further below the surface. Problem was, this wasn't unprecedented in the fact that as you go deeper, you get to gold deposits which aren't oxidized. It's called the sulfide zone. And the gold doesn't get extracted with the traditional technology, which is just crushing it and putting it across lead, and then the gold sinks through the amalgam plates, and then they would get their gold that way. When you get into the sulfide zone, the gold gets chemically wrapped up, and it doesn't just sink through the lead plates. And because of that, it's necessary to find another way. And this was the challenge that was facing the Rand. After, I think, 2 or 3 years of early huge output of those surface deposits around where they first discovered the gold was out here in the Central Rand, they hit the sulfide layer, and there was no way to extract it. There had been some technologies, but there was nothing that was certain. And there were leading technologies that could extract that gold, but nothing had been shown to work at a real industrial level. There were some lab technologies. And the two leading challenging technologies were chlorine and cyanide. And we go into a lot of detail about the technology that's not particularly relevant for our story here today. But cyanide showed, as they implemented it on the Rand in particular, that it was much more viable than chlorine. Australia had stuck with chlorine. Australia had done a fair amount of production of these sulfide ores with chlorine technology, but it was really an art to get chlorine to work right. It wasn't something that could be easily industrialized and easily used to produce massive quantities of gold like they had here on the Rand. And so working with the sort of the lab technology, they industrialized the cyanide technology on the Rand using, again, that same system that was seen on Kimberley, with this open system of metallurgists this time working from mine to mine across groups of companies who had, once they secured their property rights to the gold deposits, then they collaborated. So we had the simultaneous competition and collaboration yet again, and then working together to ensure that the risks and the uncertainties of their investments paid off. And again, this is classic collective innovation story. You have uncertainty, you have knowledge externalities, scientific uncertainty. The Cornish pumping engine is another story of where this also occurred. These incidents occur, and also sort of open source software. All these sort of open systems currently have these long precedents which aren't well documented, but are becoming increasingly so as we look back in history on some of these cases. And again, minimizing the risk and facilitating at least a level of risk which will allow the financial investment for the development of these resources. And that was critical to this development of the Rand. This gives a little bit more detail here in terms of what we were talking about. This was coming, these were the surface deposits that were being mined, and then it started to flatten out because it didn't have the technology. But then quite quickly, you see, as the cyanide technology was implemented, the output took off. We had a little war because the British and the Afrikaners didn't agree about their development path, and the British decided they had the best interest of the Afrikaners in mind. And so with Cecil Rhodes and some other characters, they fought the Second Anglo-Boer War, and as part of the British Empire, then after 1902, the gold production again took off with the cyanide technology in place. And it wasn't just South Africa where after the industrialization began that the cyanide technology mattered in terms of the world gold output. It was seen quite quickly within years, maybe a year, in Utah, Colorado, California, and Nevada. The cyanide technology was adopted and drawn from those same metallurgists that implemented it here on the Rand. And so a huge technological breakthrough came out of this region as a result of this dynamic capability and the system which had originated in Kimberley and then evolved with this discovery of the gold deposits on the Rand. And again, we're not saying that the Witwatersrand wouldn't have been developed eventually anyway, but what's important is the context of which it was developed. One, in terms of the context of the British Empire, and two, in terms of this continuity of development. And it's a lot more detailed, but there's a whole political structure which evolved in terms of development focused in terms of domestic industry, which really characterized this as a knowledge-intensive economic development sector. And that path carried forward into the legacy of South Africa's general development, which distinguishes it from the rest of Africa in terms of its development history. That growth and output, even though, as you saw, that declining now, I think 2015, South Africa's gold output was less than its 1887 level for the first time. So the industry, despite the price of gold, is battling now. But when you look at the legacy of the Rand, it's huge in terms of the world supply of gold and what it means in terms of the amount of gold that's out there. And again, the timing of how this story plays out in the context of the world monetary system is significant, but also, as we are focused on in our paper, significant for the broader development of the country. And that's where my colleague Peter HILSENRATH is going to take over and talk more about what this carried on in terms of the more general development of a really important other sector in the country.
You can take any questions now?
On how we can wait till the end, or
Okay, well, I want to pick up kind of where Tom left off. I'm going to talk about SASL, which stands for South African Synthetic Oil Limited. The South Africans had a lot of resources. They had gold, they had diamonds, coal, strategic metals, but really very little oil. And they were aware of this and decided, to get to the bottom line here, South Africa has built up a large oil from coal industry. What I'm going to talk about is the development of that industry as basically a continuation of this sort of path that was laid out initially at Kimberley, led through the Witwatersrand with gold, and I think later in the 20th century continued with the development of this synthetic fuel industry. This is a photograph of one of the synthetic fuel plants. It looks like something like a combination of an oil refinery and a nuclear power plant. I mean, it's very capital intensive, very large, very expensive, and during the apartheid era was a target for for bombing and sabotage. About 2/3 of the cost of synthetic fuel is capital cost. And you look at a photo like this and it's not hard to believe. Especially nowadays, a lot of the production is automated. You don't need, years and years ago, they had a lot of people turning valves and controlling things. Now, a lot of that's computer driven. So there's relatively few people actually operating these plants. The labor intensity that does exist now is in getting the coal. And that too is much more capital intensive than it used to be. Sasol is now a large company, $13 billion in 2015, and that's actually quite a bit down from before because of the oil prices are weaker than they have been. But they're at this point a global firm with presence not just in Southern Africa, but in Europe and the Americas. They're up in Alberta. They've got a pretty significant facility in Houston. So they're here in North America as well. Okay, so what we're talking about fundamentally is taking coal and turning those hydrocarbon molecules from the coal into hydrocarbon molecules that can be used for petrochemical hydrocarbons. And there's essentially two ways of doing this. One is what's called direct liquefaction, and that's where you take the coal and you pulverize it and you treat it under high temperatures and pressures, and then you catalyze the coal hydrocarbons into various other petrochemical hydrocarbons. That's called direct liquefaction. The second way in which you do this is called indirect liquefaction. And what indirect liquefaction does is you start out with the coal and you first gasify it. See, one of the things about coal is it tends to be mixed with inorganic, just real estate. And in fact, southern hemisphere coals tend to have much more ash, as they call it, the inorganic component, than northern hemisphere coals. So, but in either event, when you gasify the coal, the ash drops out to the bottom, and what you have are pure hydrocarbon molecules in the gas. Then you can take those molecules and with high pressures and temperatures and catalysts, you can convert those to various petrochemicals, essentially the equivalent of refined products. And in South Africa, they opted for this indirect approach, in large part because of the high ash content of the coal. They also found that there's even some properties that lend towards better